of criminals and how licensing can impact that. This fits into a larger literature on how interventions in what I'm just going to repeatedly call the legal labor market. Sorry, Bobby? Was that Bobby?
No, I think someone accidentally toggled their mute.
Okay. So interventions in the legal labor market can have spillover effects and unintended consequences. So this is pretty well established with things like wage regulations. The minimum wage and prevailing wages get a lot of press on, they have income effects, but they can also have substitution effects. The same thing can occur with licensing. So if you get to keep if you are grandfathered in with licensing regulations, you may benefit. But if you find that it's a barrier to entry in labor markets, then you may be out of luck, especially as the extent of licensing has grown over time. And we all know about that. I won't spend too much time on that, but that's the basic framework. I am not a theoretician. Yeah, I can't even say it. I don't have a full theoretical model for everyone. I have a toy model that I will be going through. But basically, it just builds off of a lot of the existing literature and applies it to the case of licensing. So we all know licensing has grown extensively, both in the number of occupations which are licensed and the requirements that come with them. In terms of crime, this is particularly relevant for ex-felons. So as Steve and Brian were talking about, like if you're an ex-felon, and in some cases, in some states, if you even have a misdemeanor, you cannot get a license. So there's a lot of reform pushes on this. But my favorite scenario or example of this was not this last year with the California wildfires that were really terrible. We actually had incarcerated prisoners who were able to get time off their sentence if they came and helped put out the fires. And then somebody did this great article, or just like a little op-ed about, these people won't be able to become firefighters when they get out, right? So we're relying on them to put out fires now, and they're risking their lives now, but they won't be allowed to become firefighters. So that's a major barrier, right? And we're not just talking about a few occupations, we're talking about 1,000 occupations in some cases, different degrees, different ways. And it becomes really hard to measure. I'm very excited for Morris's OLLRP data set, because I think that'll be revolutionary for the field. But for the time being, we're really trying to think about the degree of licensing, right? And sort of taking it as is in a panel setting. So when we think about how there are 70 million people in the United States who have a conviction record out of 330 million people, right? That's really high share. That would include young people too, like teenagers and juvenile offenders. In theory, their records could be sealed, but not if they get out after they're 18 necessarily. And we know recidivism is high during their first 3 years out of prison. So one factor could be they can't get a job, and so they go back to what they know. And what they know could be an illegal labor force. So the illegal labor force can be a lot of things. It can be things like maybe you're thinking of the drug salesman on the corner as opposed to the drug salesman in your local Safeway. It's the drug salesman on the corner, or somebody who is a thief, and those people will be in my data sets. But it's also people who, I have data on people who get arrested or charged with peddling offenses, right? So these are people who are just like unlawful peddling, and it gets them arrested or cited because they don't have a license to peddle where they are, or they haven't met all the criteria. So those are all things that are captured in this illegal labor supply. So the recidivism piece is definitely part of that. But it could also be if you are, say, entering the labor force, maybe you have less education, you don't have like technical training, you don't have peer networks, or somebody who's really like trying to help you get your first job. You may go to the peer network that's available and has no licensing requirements, which may be an illegal labor supply. So we can see potentially there's some groups who may be more sensitive to this because they face a higher barrier to entry in labor markets. If you take discrimination by itself as a barrier to entry, and then you add licensing on top of that, so that employers are selecting on things other than productivity or things like that, then you might see some of this labor supply move over into the illegal labor market, right? So we're thinking about people who are trying to maximize their utility. They have a labor-leisure trade-off. There's nothing particularly different about these people in the model. They have bills to pay, is the way I tell my students, right? They have bills to pay. This is a way to pay them. Some of these crimes are non-violent. Some of them are violent, right? So there's a dispersion here that we can think about. But as licensing can raise barriers to entry, we can expect labor markets. And we often think about labor market distortions in terms of migration or the wage effects, the prices consumers face. But we can also think about the secondary effects and spillover consequences, right? So the recidivism piece is a pretty straightforward piece, except I still don't understand why people who put out fires cannot then become firefighters when they get out of prison. But like, if you're thinking about people who don't have a criminal history and still may be caught up in this, that becomes especially concerning when we're thinking about how, especially young people, when they're looking at those prime earning years, are missing out on a chance to really develop, you know, human capital skills, social capital skills in a way that will keep them out of prisons or facing some other sort of threat later in their life. So I think it's a pretty important issue. And I've got one other paper on this that is also related to this. So if anybody else is interested in this, please let me know. The way I'll be measuring the issue here is, does more burdensome licensing actually increase income producing crime? So you notice that I've specified it's income producing. I really am not going to be selecting on whether or not it's violent. I'm actually going to get around that with the Uniform Crime Reports data. I'm interested in, could this potentially be an income source for people? Is this something that people could use to pay their bills or put food on the table? And so I'm going to measure the burden of licensing, not by an occupation, but for states. So when we're thinking about, well, maybe a state has some occupations that there are high or many requirements for, but then it has other requirements that are low or not as many for other occupations. Maybe it's easier for you to switch, right? But if you face high burdens all around, then maybe you just don't go, you don't even try, right? So I'm going to measure that in a couple different ways. So to preview my results, I find some suggestive evidence that yes, their licensing is actually linked with higher levels of income producing crime. This is consistent with my results from the other paper, and it's consistent with the other literature on labor market regulations. So people are sensitive to labor market regulations, just like any other laws or regulations that are passed. I'm finding small marginal effects from licensing an additional occupation or increasing the requirement, which makes sense, right? Like small marginal effects probably don't have small marginal increases in the amount of licensing probably don't make a big difference. But if you're thinking about the mix of licensing overall, that's probably more powerful. So the larger positive marginal effect I find is that if you are in a relatively higher licensing state group, there is at least an association. I'm not sure if I'm ready to make a claim, but an association with 36 to 52 additional income producing crimes compared to low licensing states and the comparison group. And for reference, the observation level in this paper is the police agency that's reporting the data. And on average, there are about 31 crimes per agency per month. So that's a pretty big magnitude effect. You could actually significantly reduce crime if this is truly what's going on.
Darwyyn, Morris just noted a counterexample of convicted burglars becoming licensed locksmiths. in the chat.
That's fantastic. I actually want to absolutely add that in, because that's actually one of those cases where you're like, you do have a skill set. We want to use it. And that's great. You should do that. So
Darwyyn, real quick while we're stopped here. For the UCR data, so you said you looked at the agency levels, and you just used the agencies where there's 100% reporting, or did you?
yes.
Because that's the big issue with, obviously, with that UCR stuff. They have
Agreed.
terrible underreporting problems.
I'm very annoyed about the UCR, which is why at the very end of the paper, I'm just like, I have a research assistant who's been working very hard on building the open data city data set, which I don't want to preview too much on. We've been working on it for a while. Unfortunately, his family has been impacted by COVID. So I'm not going to pressure him, and I haven't been pressuring him. But it's just one of those things where there's this other data set we're working on building, and it's very exciting. And I have some early results that I'm going to show you guys at the end. I will give you one spoiler. I have data on arrests related, I'm being very dramatic, on arrests related to licensing offenses. So I actually can see if somebody was arrested or if there was a report of a crime, and we differentiate those, related to licensing. And we very specifically pull out anything that's like related to liquor or drug licensing, because that's not what we're interested in. So I'm very excited about that. But yeah, the UCR, the FBI Uniform Crime Reports, every crime researcher's least favorite data set, even though it's what we all use, I think. It's a bit of a problem. So as Brian mentioned, you have this data is reported through agencies. Agencies face no penalty for not reporting. And so sometimes they will skip years, or they will not report for all months in a year. And then you don't know. Oh, yes, Morris. I saw recidivism and licensing. I was initially looking at it. There's a bunch of other papers going on, and I wanted to make sure I was sticking to the narrow focus here. But I do have some data on recidivism that I could draw in here if that becomes like, I mean, I have it, so it's there. So the UCR data, they're self-reported. So when you use the Uniform Crime Reports data, you should drop any observations or agencies that aren't reporting for all 12 months out of the year. And there's a variable in the data set for it. I did keep this time agencies that had a population of 0, which sounds strange, except the agency can cover areas that don't actually have a civilian population, but crime still takes place. So sometimes people drop those out, but I've kept them in here, and I'll probably drop them in a sensitivity check just to make sure they're not driving my results. And then for this study, I was using the 2017 License to Work data set that we all know from the Institute for Justice. So I was considering trying to do time series analysis with the 2012 data set as well. However, there's almost no variation between states on the variables I'm looking at for this. There's very little variation overall between the 2012 and 2017 data sets. So for the time being, I have a time series for crime, but I'm not going to have a proper diff and diff yet. I'm thinking about this as more difference in means when we get to that for the groups, but just sort of to give a descriptive sense of maybe what's going on here. But again, I'm looking forward to time series data. So those are the big data sets, and then I'm going to talk about what I'm doing with them next. Okay, so I'm just checking my time. So the Uniform Crime Reports are organized by the FBI into violent crime and property crime. This doesn't exactly line up with what I'm interested in. So normally, and I've specified out here what I have done. I've recoded it. So normally, it's the same as this, except property crime does not include robbery. Robbery goes under violent crime from the FBI. However, from my perspective, the only difference between robbery and burglary becomes that you used a weapon when you are committing robbery. You're still generating income in theory, even if it's, you know, an illicit act. So I move it over into property crime. It's a really easy shift to make. And then I've identified property crime as income producing crime, which I call commercial, and violent crime as non-income producing crime. This isn't a perfect split because of hitmen. And I'm not being specious. In my other data set, I actually have captured offenses for arrested hitmen and assassins, which is an interesting thing to find in your data set. So I recognize there could be some hitmen in the violent crime piece with murder, or if they're really good, I guess just they're not even captured there. But I'm going to assume for the moment that's not driving the results, right? There's not countless hitmen warping the FBI UC on this data set. So that's how I frame that. So the licensing burden is part of the Institute for Justice's data set. It's not how most things are organized. So they are basically showing you through the report, here's all the occupations that are licensed, and here's how much they require for education, training, exams, fees. But again, that's probably not what's driving my results here if I'm thinking about crime. An additional $10 on licensing fees is probably not driving someone to commit robbery. So I'm thinking about the cumulative effect that's basically a challenge to entry and labor markets. So I look at the number of occupations. There are 102 potential occupations in the report. No state has 102 licensed occupations, but most is 77. And then the burdensome rank and broadly onerously licensed rank, which measure similar things, are coded in a way that's just like if you're the most burdensome, you're number one. So for example, my home state, California, we are the #1 state for broadly and onerously licensed states in the country. It's a very strange distinction to have. But those things are related, right? And then average fees and days of education and training do go into the calculation for the ranks, but I separate them out. So this is on average, how many fees does the state require? On average, how many days of education and training? There's a state that requires, on average, 455 days of training, and the max is 988, which is almost 3 years. So if you're in that state, you can imagine maybe you're facing a really, really high rate. So I look at those and I code them in a way to make them useful. So everyone likes maps, right? I mean, it's 6 o'clock where you are. You've been looking at tables all day. So here's a map. This is intuitive. This is going to be actually the number of occupations of state licenses. The first thing I noticed out of this was that the West is just really pushing to license everything, which is consistent with the other literature I've seen. There's also a bit of a thread going on there through the Rust Belt. So you can see there's just high licensing trends in that direction. Low licensing is here, is 1. So this is where the least number of occupations licensed in this report is 26. Okay. So this is burden of licensing. And if this looks opposite to you from this one, you're right. Because remember, the 51st burdensome state is going to be the least burdensome state. So I'm not actually using it for a variable. If I decide to keep this strategy, I will probably recode it that way. The interesting thing is if you look at burden of licensing and onerously and broadly licensed, they're very similar. But in this category, California is still right up at the top, right? So this is the white states here, the very, very light blue states, are the ones that are most burdensome, most broadly and onerously licensed. Okay, so I didn't find it useful to just try and test on the rank for a few reasons. One is that a lot of these states are pretty close together. So I'll have like one that's, you know, well, the 25th and the 26th, right? How different are they in terms of relative degree and how burdensome they are, or how onerously licensed they are? Probably not much. And a lot of them are actually clustered when you look at the average fees and things like that. And I was also concerned about reversion to the mean. So instead of just regressing on the rank, or, you know, regressing on that at all, I used it to do a sample selection later on. But first, I was just going to see, these are things that are overall by state, what's going on. Number of occupations, the fees, again, logged, and education and training. And we have to include month because of the variation in, the seasonal variation in crime. People don't actually buy as many drugs in January as they do in May. It's cold out and they don't want to go see their dealer. So you actually have fewer observations there. People are more likely to commit homicide in hot summer months. So it is very actually sensitive to seasonality. So we always control for that. Is that a question, Ned? I get like a brief notification of chat and then it goes away. Okay, so this is going to be sort of the most general basic OLS you could get. I've gone over these things. You can see this is for the whole sample. This is going to be all states. Looks pretty, it's going to look pretty similar to the selections overall. The variation is going to come from the groups that I pull out. The 8.6 million is going to be New York City. So, as I said, basic OLS. I'm just looking at all these things and just seeing if there's any sort of association at all. And it seems like there's something there. It could be noise, but it seems like when you look at this, if you're looking at logged fees, this is a really tiny result. This looks huge. I've checked it multiple times. It's correct. It's just when you add the state controls, this result jumps significantly. And I think that's being driven by outliers. So that also gets addressed by my next approach. But you can see like education is not related to crime, which if anything wasn't going to be related to crime, I would think that education would be least likely to be associated with increases in crime.
Darwyyn, Brad has a clarification question. Can you remind us what an observation is here?
Yes, the observation is at the agency level. So it's going to be by month for an individual agency in an individual state in a year. All good?
Sorry, can I ask a follow-up question? So what does it mean? What does education of an agency mean?
So the education is going to be the state level requirements that cover the state that the agency is in. So the agency is reporting the number of crimes that occur at their agency by month.
Okay, I'm sorry, you probably already said this. What's an example of an agency?
Oh, it's a police agency, a police department.
So like a city?
It can be a city. Some of them are counties. Some of them are not actually, they don't actually follow like a normal municipal format. So it's not necessarily, like I can't link it to Puma right away very easily. Ed and I spent a long time trying to do this for another project, and it's pretty time intensive.
Okay, but sorry, so do these different things here, number of occupations, logged fees, education, do those vary within a state at all?
No, they vary across states.
Okay, do they vary within across years at all within a
Nope.
state?
This is like just seeing if there's any, before I went and did a whole bunch of other stuff, I just wanted to see if I'm looking at crimes, and I'm basically looking at crimes by state, right? And I have the individual months from the agencies that I can roll up, but it's basically looking at states across time or for crime, but I don't I would say that this is just an association. This is not the model I want, right? This is just due diligence before I do the next thing.
I guess I'm just trying to figure out what, so when you have, it seems like you shouldn't be able to have state fixed effects, maybe, if I'm thinking of that right. If
Oh,
nothing-
so they're not fixed effects. They're just individual controls by state to group for all the agencies within that state.
So what does state mean then column 4?
So column 4 is the state is I have the control for states. But it's just identifying that this is not just by the year or the month, which would be the time variant piece. So again, I think this is really just picking up a lot of noise. But it's where you have the month piece and the year piece are the time variant pieces. But there's just capturing the control for each individual state over time for the different crimes. Because the observation is at the agency level.
Okay, I could follow up after. I think I still have a question about it, but I can follow up after.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's a little confusing as it is because we don't have time variation for the state on licensing. And that's where I'm doing it for due diligence, but that's it. But I think the other approach is a little bit closer to what I'd like to do in a complete sense. So this is just making sure there is a link, or like it's not basically not even a t-test, but just making sure I'm not going to find absolutely nothing before I keep going. So this is where I start to split states. So I mentioned I was concerned about reversion to the mean, especially if I'm looking at just high licensing states and low licensing states. So what I did was I selected samples based off of these variables. Okay, so these are the things that are available at the state level from the report. Average fees, days of education is going to be its own thing that I pull out, and the first 3 are going to be their own sample. So this is the method that I use to pull through. My big concern is that I can't vary licensing over time. My sort of next step, depending on when the time series data on licensing becomes available, is to consider a crime intervention done at state levels, because then I can do a more traditional difference in difference. And thinking about licensing as a high or low licensing state allows for that. So first, I identified the quartiles for each of these 5 things. And if you're in the top quartile, I identify you as high licensing, and vice versa for the bottom quartile. And then there's the 2 quartiles in between. I'm going to go over what that means in a moment, but that's just the first step that I did. That's going to create the base for my next sample. Okay, so I'll actually jump to this first. So this is what you can see what it looks like. If you're in the top quartile for number of occupations, you're in this list. If you're in the top quartile for how burdensome the rank is, you're in this list, and so forth. So I used that approach to try and identify states that were consistently burdensome, either for what I'm calling extensive margins here or intensive margins. And I do the same thing for the bottom quartile. You might notice that states that tend not to license on a lot of things. But one restriction I put on the data here was that for this group of occupations and the 2 ranks, the state had to appear in all 3 columns for me to include it. This created a regional effect, which we'll get to. But the same rule applies to this. You had to appear in all 3 of these columns or both of these columns to be included. And that creates a sample that I will go over on a map. But just to sort of give you an idea of what this means, the top quartile is licensing between 67 to 77 occupations compared to 26 to 40. The burden rank is going to be the same for burden rank and the onerous rank for both of the groups. And the average fees are significantly different, as well as education and training. So the average fees in the top quartile group are between $327 and $704, compared to the very low end, which is $76 and $188. And then the education and training is also significantly different. So you have 475 days, which is over a year, to almost 3 years at 988 days. And then down here, you have less than a year required. So these are average requirements. And then what I do is I say, I basically create dummy variables. If you're in the top quartile, I identify you as equal to 1. And if you're in the bottom quartile, I identify you as equal to 0. So I'm not using the actual values here. I'm using it to select a sample. This is kind of getting close to a two-way fixed approach, but it's not what I'm doing. We'll see. So this is the first sample where it's got the number, you're selected either based off of the number of occupations, rank, and for burden and onerous. The first thing that jumps out is the West is just doing its own thing. The bottom quartile includes Alaska, and it's got a lot more states, but it also has much lower crime to begin with, and there are fewer agencies. So the panel actually ends up not totally balanced, but not too different. I don't think I have that table here, but I do the same thing again for fees and days of education and training. Again, the West is just extremely high. And on top of this, on top of this, Hawaii is now included. Hawaii just is pushing further west. So I can't do a census control because it would just be the West explains everything. The important thing on these maps is if it's in white, it's not included in my sample. Okay, so if it's white, it just doesn't get in there at all because those are the two quartiles in between. Okay, so my main concern with this approach is there's not enough regional variation, which trades off against the piece where if I have them too close together in terms of how they rank, then I'm worried about reversion to the mean. So we'll see. Right now, I'm using only a few years of data. I've tried it with 1 year of data. It's basically the same. I just don't trust only 1 year of data for crime because crime trends. So I wanted to use the years in between the 2012 and 2017 license to work data sets. Okay, so where's the best way to describe this? So the one comparison group is either commercial or non-commercial. Commercial equal to 1 or commercial equal to 0. And the other comparison group is if you're in the top quartile or the bottom quartile. And then I do an interaction between them just to see conditional on if you're in a high licensing state, if you're in a top quartile and it's property crimes, is it significantly different from the other categories? So again, getting close to a two-way fixed effects, but I'm not doing that because I wanted to have multiple years for the moment. You might remember this is pretty close to the average number of crimes as in the full sample. Everything else is not too far off. The maximum number of population has fallen significantly because we lost New York. And yet we still see the variation in education and training and the fees. And then we do this again for the second sample. Again, not massively different, it's pretty pretty close. The two samples are not extremely different, which supports this, but it's definitely we're not seeing a lot of variation in the average number of crimes by agency. So this is, again, a modified diff and diff. I've used this approach for another paper. I've used this approach, or there's the minimum wage paper that uses this with the border study. I just saw an article challenging it, so that's fun. Somebody else can get published in QJE, and then somebody else publishes a paper saying, no, you can't. So that's good. My initial results for the first sample, which is the number of occupations, or selected on the number of occupations, burden, and onerous ranks, is suggestive that it does actually have, that higher licensing does actually increase income producing crime. I'm hesitant to say increasing, but the rest of the literature that I've seen has also found similar results. So I think this needs to be evaluated, and I need to do selection tests and test for observables and all the normal things you would do. But I'm also veering towards, I just would like to work on getting some linear component to it for the licensing piece. I would like to actually evaluate this over time. And so my next move is looking at crimes and crime policy with respect to licensing. So there's a question?
We do have a few questions in the chat if you're unable to see those.
Okay, no, let's see. I have to do the drop down. That's right. Licensing attainment by state. That's possible. Bobby, I can potentially do matching with the other data set that I have. So that's, or I could do a synthetic control. That would be the other approach to use here. 3 quartiles. That's an interesting idea. I will look into that in my notes. Okay. I like these ideas. Thank you, guys. I jumped to the next slide, but you see the results. Again, this is the same direction. I'm not getting results that say positive one way and negative another. The results seem to be generally trending towards positive and significant. This is just the selection on the sample if you're in the high average fees and high education and training compared to the very low. So the way to interpret this is in the high licensing burden state with property crimes, they're higher compared to all the other comparison groups. I think this is an interesting one to think about in particular because it's the fees and days of education and training on average, which represents something real that a potential worker would face. And this is also on intensive margins, but ranked for the entire state, right? So comparing intensive margins across states on average as opposed to for a specific occupation. I wanted to talk briefly about the expanded data set because this is where I keep trying to push this paper and I keep getting into roadblocks. We've all had COVID problems, but this is where I like to do. So this is the Open Data City project. If you may remember this from the Obama administration, the Justice Department under Obama promoted the Open Data Project to increase transparency with respect to police use of force. And cities took that and said, what if we just shared everything we have? Which is not usually the direction that I see from cities, but everything is just like, they'll share information on traffic cameras, they'll share information on crimes and arrests, which is what I'm using. They do have a lot of data on police use of force. They do have data on traffic tickets. They do have information about zoning. I've never seen a city go, what if we just shared everything with the public. The unfortunate piece of this is that these data sets don't talk to each other. So they're not all uploaded to a central site where everything matches. It's this city did that and this city did this other thing, and now we have to try and make them talk to each other. So this is what my research assistant and I have been working on. I've collected data, and he's been working on coding it with me for 27 cities in 23 states. In particular, I was looking at the categories of theft, drug sales, prostitution, and we can separate out the supply and demand side, which is important. And we can easily separate out the supply and demand side for drugs, but it's really important to do that for prostitution as well. And then a very large category that is currently called other, because there's so much variation in what these cities are sharing about the different crimes that happen in their city or the things they arrest people for. Again, not really sure how this happened, but every 2 weeks, Chicago uploads an additional batch of data to their open data website. So Alicia, you should definitely check this out. And it goes back to 2001. And it's every 2 weeks, they're just rolling it out.
That
So-
sounds really nice.
You know, I'm so close to like getting this. We're very, very close, and it just feels like it's, and that gives you a component where I could like look at the local level, but it's fascinating data because it's actually at the street level. I can tell where you were, when the crime happened or the arrest happened. I have demographic information. And I also have information for things that the FBI doesn't normally share data on, like if you were arrested for a licensing offense, because we actually have the offense description. So 4 cities in 3 states so far. I'm hoping that as we go back to the other cities, like they start to add more. But so far, these 4 cities are now sharing information about licensing. They actually track this and report it, which I currently have 16,107 offenses identified for licensing offenses in my data set. I kind of feels like too much power. And so just to give you guys sort of a sense of what's going on here, 2 of the cities are in California. A lot of this stuff is happening again at the city level that we're looking at. So massage therapist licensing, Ed, you and I know about this, right? That's on the offenses list. I just pulled a sample for you guys so you could sort of get a sense of what's in this. I am happy to share it. We want to make sure it's ready. But like, if you're interested in working on this data, like I'm very excited to work on it. So we have plenty of stuff on vehicle salesmen, taxis everywhere, all these unlicensed taxi operators, contracting without a license. My favorite is the addition of including in an emergency. So there's you're contracting without a license, and then you're contracting without a license in an emergency, how dare you. There's a lot of massage establishment and parlor permit violations. We don't get direct detail on that. I've been going through the data very carefully, and none of these are also cross-coded as prostitution. So that's actually like not what's happening here. It's probably their permit fell behind and things like that. They're probably getting more visits because they're massage establishments. Operating without a bail license. The unlicensed veterinarians and attorneys are fun. And as I mentioned, the peddling without a license, right? This is just so common. I see it in every city that I look at. And so we just have to pull it out. But like we're currently working on New York. And New York is difficult. New York is the stop and frisk data. I have worked with this data before. I know there's licensing offenses in there because I've worked with it before. It's also a data set that was gotten through FOIA and a court order, and they don't like coding it. And so there's just no consistency in how it's done. So Alicia says I'm out of time, so I'm just going to show you that and leave you with fun trends for licensing offenses. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Darwyyn. So that officially concludes the presentations for today. There's going to be an optional dinner / cocktail hour. And there's a separate link to that. That's right, Alicia? Thank you. So hopefully you'll join us for that. And if not, we will certainly see you tomorrow. Just another housekeeping item. I've seen a couple of you, and I know not all of you are active on social media, but we would always appreciate if you have anything you'd like to share. Please do tag